chapter that has been assigned this week was originally 2 chapters, one on the Mongols and the West, the other on the Mongols and the East. This made the Mongols pretty much the only people in world history who were granted 2 chapters. The Romans didn't get 2 chapters. Maybe the British get a couple of chapters, but by and large, this was an outgrowth of the idea in world history that the Mongols have been not only studied from a particular and unfavorable point of view in an unwarranted fashion, but also that they did something that was of extraordinary importance, namely creating a land link across Eurasia between peoples of the East, peoples of the West, and to some degree peoples of the South. So the Mongols have been largely rehabilitated. It's hard to think of a people less worthy of rehabilitation in the sense that they really did kill an awful lot of people. And I can't quite see us, at some future date saying, Hitler wasn't really so bad. Yeah, he killed a lot of people, but just think of his vision for Europe. But with the Mongols, nobody denies the stories, although it's often believed that they are exaggerated. Where you take all the people in a city and you divide them by the number of people in your army, and you get, let's say, 10, and so you assign 10 people per soldier to kill, because that way you can efficiently kill everybody, and then you come back 2 or 3 days later to find everyone who was hidden out in the ruins, or kill the cats and dogs and so forth. These stories are so lurid and so extreme, so focused on cities. The depopulation of the countryside just doesn't have as much publicity as killing everybody in the city. The thought that I have pressed on you, at least from the Middle Eastern perspective, that the areas that the Mongols entered in the Middle East were already in a semi-ruined and depopulated state has not yet been integrated into world history in general, but I think eventually it will be, because I think it's fairly clear that this was to some degree true, and perhaps true of the territories of Kiev and Russia and some other lands that became prey to the Mongols because they had already entered into times of troubles and political and economic, sometimes demographic disorder. But be that as it may, you have this amazing phenomenon of these enormously destructive invasions carried out by or at the behest of the leaders of pastoral tribes in Mongolia, emerging as a great moment in history is something that you really have to ask questions about. Is there something about the Mongol experience that goes beyond simply the narrative? But I don't know. But let me just suggest one thing, or a couple of things. One of them is that in some ways the Mongols seem to prefigure modernity. How? They are not religiously motivated. They are people who operate from what we in modern times call a realpolitik. They look at the political situation, they take advantage of it, they create new realities, but they don't do it in the service either of a religion or of a particular ideology, or even for that matter, of a particular culture. Rather, they bring into their orbit, into their army, but also into their entire imperial structure, people of many different ethnicities, many different talents, many different languages, many different religions, members of the ruling family of the family of Genghis Khan, belong to different religions and seem to have had no conflict, at least in the central lands, based on the question of religion. So they appear to be kind of a modern state where talented people can rise, even if they are not part of the ruling family or part of a hereditary aristocracy, simply because they are really good at what they do. Another aspect that is appealing to some historians is the fact that they liked to organize things in decimal fashion, so that you would have units of 100, units of 1,000, units of 10,000, and so forth. That you would have, instead of having the tribe or the chieftainship or something kind of funky and primitive like that be your organizing principle, you had what appears to be a rational principle. You know, not only did you have this decimal organization, but it carried over into the tax area, where you would charge a certain area with supporting a certain decile of warriors. They appeal to some people because of a hardiness that allows them seemingly to travel unlimited distances and go into battle and prevail against enemies that are on home turf and are better armed and more deeply inspired to win the battle, and the Mongols win anyway. In other words, you have, again, the temptation is to think blitzkrieg, the idea of invincibility. These are kind of modern thoughts, things that will perhaps resonate more with the Napoleonic period than with Hitler's Germany. Although you could argue that there's more of an ideology with Napoleon, certainly he did not favor any particular religion, and there was pretty much an opening to talent in his empire. So that's one way to look at it that I think has appealed to some world historians. Another way is this question of connecting across Eurasia. And what has been particularly appealing is that the linkage across Eurasia is being carried out by an Asian people, not by Europeans, and it is a kind of analog for the world exploration by sea that the Europeans undertake a century and a half later. In other words, you have this nice balance. The Europeans, spread around the world and bring people into contact by creating maritime empires. The Mongols spread by land and bring people into contact through a land empire. for people who believe that world history is, in its essence, the story of peoples coming into contact and getting to know each other better and better, the Mongol period is wonderful, because it not only produces the reality of this kind of trans-Eurasian contact, but it produces a large number of narratives. And from a historical point of view, one travel account is worth, 3 chronicles, which is worth 100 quantitative series. I mean, it's, there's just to be able to talk about, somebody who went someplace and saw something, so forth, has just been very, very riveting for historians. There have been questions about some of these chronicles. Marco Polo, for example. I myself have had great questions about William of Rubruck, and I was wrong. William of Rubruck was a person who traveled out to a clergyman, traveled out to the Mongol capital in Karakoram and wrote a very influential account of the Mongols. And in it he says things about wheeled transport that simply made no sense at all. He said, well, there was a vehicle that was 30 feet wide, and it was pulled by 22 oxen in 2 lines, 11 in the first line going across and 11 in front. And I read that and I thought, how do you do that? How do you get those oxen to pull at the same time? How do you harness them? And how do you find an axle that's 30 feet long, and how much would it weigh, and how big would the house have to be on top of it? And I decided William of Rubruck was pulling the collective European leg. And then recently I ran across a scroll painting from shortly after the Mongol Dynasty in China. It's a Chinese scroll painting that actually shows a vehicle drawn by 22 horses, lined, arranged in exactly the same way. And just as in William of Rubruck's account, there is no sign of a driver. Now, it may be that the Chinese artist read William of Rubruck, but this is unlikely because he wrote in Latin and the Chinese generally didn't have access to Latin text. But the thing is, some of the things that seem so fantastic and, in this case, to me, unbelievable in the accounts about the Mongols seem, in fact, to have been true, and that is quite intriguing because it makes you wonder where it all began. How did this culture come into being? There is, of course, the historical rule that causation recedes to the point of least knowledge, so that if you have ruled out every other explanation of how something came about, you look for the most obscure place that you know nothing about, and you say it must have happened there. And this has been the great help of historians of Arabia and Central Asia, where they can kind of assume unspecified tribal processes and cultural amalgams that lead to great conquering moments, whether it's the Arabs or before them the Aramaeans, or whether it's the Mongols or before them the Huns or the Xiongnu. But the fact of the matter is we simply don't know very much about the roots of this whole Mongol phenomenon. What I'm going to take up today and again on Thursday is actually going to address something a little bit different. And this is the narrative strategy that we adopted in our book that looked at the Mongols as a as a stimulus that spurred various responses among various peoples in different parts on different fringes of the Mongol Empire. So in the west, you have the Russians and the Lithuanians, the Mamluks in Egypt, and the Ottomans. Eventually, you might even include the founders of the Mongol Dynasty in India. In the east, you have particularly the reaction in China with the rise of the Ming Dynasty, and the question of Japan, a country that experienced 2 Mongol invasions and remained unconquered, but was changed because of the experience. When you take an entity, a something, and you say what's interesting about it is the responses to it, you are, to some degree, diminishing the originality or the intent or the agency of the people who are doing the reacting. You're saying, well, they wouldn't have acted this way had it not been for this event. And therefore, the Mongol conquests in the 13th century are portrayed as being important because of what they set in motion among peoples whom they came in contact with, and not simply for what they did in their own domains. To say this is to create a kind of impression of similarity, that the Lithuanians and the Russians and the Ottoman Turks and the Mamluks in Egypt are similar because they're responding to the Mongols. The same way that perhaps the Koreans and the Chinese and the Japanese have a certain similarity in their responses to the Mongols. This is very different, for example, from how we treated and how most historians treat something like the Roman Empire. In other words, with the Roman Empire, you say, let us tell the story of the empire itself. You know, a small agrarian kingdom rises to become a powerful republic. It metamorphoses into an empire. It becomes a continent-spanning entity. And let us follow that story from the kings of Rome down through the heyday of the Roman Empire down to its collapse in the 5th century in the West and somewhat later in the East. And then you say, well, okay, the Roman Empire had an impact because we have Romance languages. So it had an impact upon the Spaniards and the French and the Romanians. And it had an impact upon the people in the East or the people in Africa. But the center of the story really is the narrative of the empire itself. And you don't very often find a historian who will say, let us compare the evolution of Berber tribal power in Africa with the evolution of Germanic tribal power in the north of Europe, seeing Rome as the stimulus and this as the response. So with the Mongol Empire, where the central narrative is available but not really given very much. That is to say, people are interested in Roman emperors. They're not very interested in Mongol emperors other than Genghis Khan himself. There is a central narrative, but what we're urging in our book and in other works you have a similar strategy, is to look at how you compare the responses. I think it probably would be fair to say that the responses have more difference than similarity. And that if you were to take these responses as separate narratives, you might have a more useful grounding for writing about the later history. One of the common features that you have, however, when you take the Mongol experience as a stimulus to which various peoples respond, is that you have the question of fear. There are a couple of books that have been written on the history of fear. And you look at them, and they tend to look at fear in a kind of undifferentiated way. That is to say, you have periods when people are afraid of disease, or when they're afraid of an invasion, or whether they're afraid of modernity, Luddite opposition to machines or something like that. But with the Mongols, you have the idea that fear becomes an instrument of political leverage, and that the people who deploy that instrument do it consciously, and they do it for particular ends. The example I want to take is the example of the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria. We know much more about them than we do about either the early Ottomans or the Russians or the Lithuanians. The Mamluks have been fairly massively studied, particularly in the last 30 years or so. For a very long time, what we knew about the Mongols in the Middle East, where they had come on two occasions, first in the period 1218 to 1220 under Genghis Khan himself, where they brought most of Iran under Mongol rule, and a second time in the 1250s, culminating in the destruction of the city of Baghdad and the death of the last Abbasid caliph there under Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu. What we have known about the Mongols has come from two sources. First, the narratives of the Mongol conquests written by people who worked for the Mongols, particularly Persian historians who were in the employ of the Mongol Khans, and who wrote probably the most horrific tales. Many of the classic destruction stories that tell us about the Mongol onslaught come from Persian historians who are writing for the Mongols. Why they're doing this, it is not entirely clear. There are times when conquerors relish the destruction that they bring about, or the depredations and the killing that comes about at their design. The classic model of this are the old Assyrian emperors back before 500 BC, where we have these magnificent bas-reliefs now largely in the British Museum showing the sacking of cities and the killing of captives, but you get a lot of it in Egyptian art as well. And it's presumed that this is to glorify the ruler, because the ruler is a presence in all of this. In the Mongol narratives, the ruler is not that riveting a presence, at least not in terms of ordering something. In other words, you don't see the ruler portrayed as sort of personally going and conquering. It's more a modern type of narrative? Well, there's an army, there's a bureaucracy, there are orders given, there are things that happen, and everybody dies. So it doesn't quite fit the Akkadian imperial model. It's often been argued that the purpose of these narratives, or one of the purposes, was to enhance fear, to make it so that a ruling minority, and certainly the Mongols, wherever they were, outside of Central Asia proper, represented a very small number of rulers, ruling class, to make it so that nobody would rebel against the Mongols because they had heard the stories of what would happen if they did. In other words, using fear for propaganda purposes, particularly in cities that had to be used as administrative centers. So the fact that these narratives are written mostly in Persian, considering that the Mongols didn't read Persian for the most part, they weren't being written to be read by the Mongols. We don't actually have any chronicle in Mongolian language other than the so-called secret history of the Mongols, which is the story of Temujin's rise to power and his becoming the historical figure of Genghis Khan. So they're not being written at the behest of Mongol rulers for the edification of the Mongols, but presumably for the edification of the people whom the Mongols have achieved dominion over. And this supports the idea that this is kind of propaganda writing. Does that mean that the massacres did not occur? At one time, I kind of thought that maybe a lot of this is just really, really overwritten. Then I found that picture of the 22 oxen. No. In the city that I did research on for my doctoral dissertation, which was once a huge city, the city of Nishapur, 100 to 200,000 people, at its peak around 1,000. The city had fallen by about 80% in population, judging from the area of settlement, by 1150. The Mongols come through some 70 years later. The report of the destruction of the city is that everything in the city was leveled, that there were no buildings left standing. And when I look at aerial photographs of the medieval city that was abandoned for a variety of reasons in the course of the 1100s and perhaps late 1000s, I can see evidence of all sorts of buried structures. It was very clear that this was a city that was simply abandoned while it was largely intact. And over the centuries, wind had deposited dust and covered it to a depth of around 20 feet or so. But then I'd look over at the walled area that surrounded the portion of the city that was destroyed by the Mongols, and there are no ruins. It appears to be a completely flat surface with no undulations or hummocks indicating some buried structure. So I thought, well, maybe the Mongols really did destroy everything. It's hard to know. We haven't really tried a sort of test of that sort of narrative. But anyway, that's one of the sources. The other source, in a sense, is more interesting because it consists of works in Arabic written by people who were not conquered by the Mongols. And this is where the question of fear comes in. Arabic readers were told that the Mongols had a law code known as the Yasa, just as the Muslims had a law code known as the Sharia. The Yasa was sort of portrayed as the anti-Sharia, and it was said that in the areas where the Mongols conquered, that the Yasa replaced the good Muslim law of the Sharia, in the same way that the Sharia has replaced American law in Dearborn and some non-existent town in Oklahoma. And very much in the same way. That is to say, there was never any particular evidence that the Yasa had replaced the Sharia, except that it was stated in these Arabic sources. So what did the Yasa consist of? Well, there's not a lot of detail given, but there are some details. The person who sort of unpacked the notion of the Yasa was David Ayalon, a very, very distinguished Israeli scholar of the last generation. Gave terrible lectures, but he was really a very good scholar. And he wrote 2 articles, I believe they were in Studia Islamica, about what was the Yasa. And in it he told the stories as they were told in Arabic sources of the Mamluk period. And then he looked into the substance of them. It's fairly clear that the Arabic sources were intended to terrify Muslims about the Mongols. There were various instances. The only one that really sticks well in my mind is the whole question of meat. The Quran prohibits the eating of meat that has blood in it. It's the reason all of your Middle Eastern friends always ask for well done when they order a steak. The only people in the world who always order things well done. For the Mongols, it seems, it is said, that the quality of the meat is improved by having the blood in the meat. So what Muslims would do would be to cut the throat of an animal and hang it up for the blood the heart is still beating, and allow the blood to be pumped out so that you get rid of the blood. And then in halal butchering or kosher butchering, you have meat that doesn't have any blood in it. What the Muslims were told was that for the Mongols, and I can't verify this at first hand, I have no idea actually how the Mongols killed animals, but what they were told was that the Mongols would cut into the abdomen and reach in and squeeze the heart so that the animal would die, but the blood would not be pumped out because there would be no more pumping of the heart. Now, first, this was really disgusting, but it also led people to think, well, if you live in the lands of the Mongols, you're doomed to be a vegan, I suppose. Maybe that's the way they look at it. But all the meat, there'll be like the Sharia requires that you have halal butchering, the Yasa requires that you have Yasa butchering, and Muslims can't live there. And that was kind of the notion that Muslims can't live where the Mongols rule. Because the Yasa is so different from the Sharia that Muslims simply cannot live there. There are all sorts of analogies in later times with where Muslims can live or where non-Muslims can live and so forth, what kind of circumstances they must cope with. But what never seemed to get noted in the medieval period was that the lands that the Mongols occupied were chock full of Muslims who were not all vegetarians, and that the Mongols themselves converted to Islam, or at least in the Western areas, in Russia and Iran they did, making the whole issue moot. But the fear of the Mongols was the important thing here. Why the fear was so important gets into the question of the reaction of people in the Middle East to the coming of the Mongols. Let me go back to as I mentioned earlier when I talked about the chapter on the rise of Islam, that there's a very awkward, from my point of view, awkward breaking off point in that chapter where you sort of stop when the Mongols come. Because we were going to cover that later on, namely in this chapter. But the reason it's awkward is because there is more continuity across this invasion moment of the early 1200s than at first appears. So you have a story that goes back to the Crusades. Crusades start in 1095. You have the taking of Jerusalem by the Crusaders and the establishment of 4 small crusading principalities. And then in 1187, Jerusalem is retaken by Saladin. By the time, and I've mentioned this before, by the time Jerusalem is retaken, Iran and Iraq have fallen into a state of very substantial decline. That is to say, the population has fallen, the agricultural economy has dwindled, and this is, in my view, related very largely to climatic factors. In any event, the Iraqis and the Iranians played comparatively little role in the whole saga of the Crusades. When Saladin conquered Jerusalem, he sent a letter to the Caliph saying he conquered Jerusalem, his troops had conquered Jerusalem. The Caliph sent a rude letter back saying that your troops did not conquer Jerusalem, the troops of the Caliph conquered Jerusalem, and they had this quarrel over who gets credit for retaking Jerusalem. The next year, there is a fight between the pilgrims from Syria and the pilgrims from Iraq when they get to Mecca to see which will be the more prominent pilgrim group. A year or two after that, we have our first inscription that uses a new title. Khatam al-Haramain, meaning the guardian of the 2 holy places. Saladin is guardian of 2 holy places, and in the same inscription he is mentioned as the master of the Haram al-Sharif, of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So you have Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem linked in this particular inscription, and they're all put under the authority of Saladin. This title, Imam al-Haramain, subsequently becomes the most important political attribution of later Muslim rulers. I don't know of any instance of any caliph being specifically called the servitor of the 2 holy places. But up to that point in time, up to the 1190s, say, it was understood that the responsibility for the maintenance of Mecca, Medina, lay primarily with the caliph in Baghdad. So now what you have basically is a challenge where Saladin, who has a victorious army under his control, is the master of these holy places, and the caliph does not acknowledge this. And it's seizing a function of the caliphate, not the title of caliph, but rather a function of the caliphate, and arrogating it to the new master of Syria and Egypt. This title is passed on to Salah ad-Din's successors in his dynastic family, the Ayyubid family. And the last Ayyubid it dies in the year 1250. During that period of time, that is, say, from the late 1100s down to the middle of the 1200s, you have the first substantial building of services in Mecca and Medina for pilgrims. You get the first schools, you get the first Sufi hostels, you get a change in the taxation rate on pilgrims, which had been fairly punitive before Salah ad-Din, and he cancels the tax. In other words, there's every indication that taking care of pilgrimage business had become a very important part of the political identity of Saladin and his family. Connected to this was the taking over of Yemen, which was the other end of the the caravan road from Syria down to Mecca and down to southern Arabia. So now Egypt and Syria and Yemen are somewhat combined. Those of you who recollect the history of Gamal Abdel Nasser will be reminded of when Syria and Egypt joined together as the United Arab Republic, and then the Egyptians sent an expeditionary force to Yemen to support a revolutionary movement there, with the idea that a Yemen Arab Republic would be joining with Syria and Egypt in a political linkage. Prior to Salah ad-Din, Yemen really had been a world apart. But now it becomes of interest to Syria and Egypt, and remains of interest to Syria and Egypt down to the present day because of the pilgrimage. And that is the common interest here. 1250, there is the Fifth Crusade comes to an end with the defeat of the European Crusaders. The descendant of Salah ad-Din is killed, the ruler, the Sultan, who is ruling in Egypt and Syria, Salah Ayyub. And the Mamluks, the Turkish soldiers who work for him, are fearful that they will be displaced by the next member of the Ayyubid family coming in from Syria to take over as Sultan. These were soldiers in a regiment known as the Salahiyah, after Salah Ayyub, who was the last of the Ayyubids to rule in Cairo. These soldiers said, "We defeated the Crusaders, and we will not accept the idea that we should be displaced by some other group of Turkish soldiers from Syria." So they killed the incoming Sultan, and then didn't know quite what to do, because the Ayyubids were legitimate rulers, because they had achieved great things in defeating the Fatimids in Egypt and defeating the Crusaders in Jerusalem. They had acquired a legitimacy by conquest, whereas the the Mamluks were just soldiers. Individuals who came into Egypt through slave transactions, mostly Turkish speakers from Central Asia, who were raised in a barracks, trained to be soldiers, converted to Islam, but they were not really a part of Egyptian society. They were simply a mercenary, not a mercenary, but a slave military corps. The highest ranking of the Mamluks were commanders of regiments. Now, two of these commanders sort of jointly held power, after 1250, and represented a potential shift of the power to the Mamluks as a whole. It was complicated by the question of who was going to marry the widow of the deceased sultan, and would this person then rule in the name of an infant son? It's a complicated story. The widow's a very colorful figure named Shajaradur. But in the long run, what made the shift from dynastic legitimacy to Mamluk rule possible was the Mongols. In the year 1258, the last caliph was, according to the chronicles, rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death. This is on the principle that you should not shed the blood of a ruler, and so you turn him into pate without anyone seeing any blood, because he's kind of a cannelloni operation. So the last caliph is killed in 1258. Baghdad is, what's left of Baghdad after a century or more of decline, is destroyed, and the Mongols move on into Syria. Then there is a death in the ruling family, and the Hulagu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, is called back to, or returns to Karakorum in Mongolia to take part in the family council called a Kurultai that chooses the next great Khan. He left a army in place in Syria, and that army was like the army that had been left in Iran after Genghis Khan had gone back to Mongolia. It was expected to hold territory, but not to expand territory. It was there to consolidate and hold the position rather than to extend it. That is the army that the Mamluks went out to battle in the year 1260. At the Battle of Ain Jalut, meaning the spring of Goliath, the Mamluks defeated the Mongols. This is not the only defeat the Mongols ever suffered by any means, but it certainly was a signal defeat, because the Mongols never proceeded past that point. But nobody knew that was going to be the result. What they knew was that they had defeated a Mongol army, but not the main Mongol army. They had not defeated Hulagu, the ruler. They didn't know when the Mongols would come again, but they were fairly sure the Mongols would come again. So the two Mamluk commanders who had marched out of Cairo, whose names were Qutuz and Baibars, they marched back toward Cairo with their victorious troops. Qutuz never made it back, and that meant that Baibars gets back to Cairo and becomes the Sultan in the year 1260. This is the beginning of the Mamluk Dynasty, or the Mamluk state. Because from 1250 to 1260, it is ambiguous exactly what the legitimacy is of the Mamluks who are controlling things in Cairo. But after 1260, the legitimacy is established on the basis of their having defeated the Mongols. That legitimacy is enhanced and extended in proportion to the amount of fear of the Mongol return that could be induced. So those people who wrote books under Mamluk rule had a very, very powerful incentive to portray the Mongols as the anti-Muslims, the people under whom you cannot live because they do not understand or respect the Sharia. And so the Yasa becomes this horrible specter that you would have to live under the Yasa if the Mongols ever came back. The Mongols in Iran come to an end with the death of the last Mongol Sultan in Iran in 1335. By that time, the Mamluks have been ruling in Egypt and Syria for 75 years. They are well established. They continue to rule until 1516, when the Ottoman Empire takes over in Egypt and Syria and adds those territories to Ottoman lands in what is now Turkey and in Europe. So the Mamluks come into being, and their legitimacy as a state, with legitimacy based very heavily upon their the fear of the Mongols. But it would be a mistake to simply look at them as people who were only mobilizing support through the boogeyman specter of another Mongol invasion. That is a part of it, just as it's a part of it in Lithuania, part of it in Russia. But it's by no means the only story. And this is where the problem of structuring a book where the Mongols are central and saying that the people whom the Mongols come in contact are made similar because of their reactions to the Mongols, this is where the problem arises, is that there really is a very different narrative that you can adopt about the Mamluks that does not replace, but it certainly accompanies this one. This other narrative, I would say, is largely based on what happens with the pilgrimage. In other words, the Mamluks inherit not only rule in Egypt and Syria, but they inherit control of Mecca, Medina, and, of course, Jerusalem. Not only that, but there's no longer any caliph. In the year 1258, or at least there's no caliph in the generally recognized sense. In the year 1258, the last caliph in Baghdad had been killed. For a 2-year period until 1260 and the Battle of Ain Jalut, there had been several people who were in one form or another described or referred to as a caliph. Like the ruler of Tunisia was, in the minds of some people, particularly Tunisians, a caliph. The governor of Mecca could be seen as a caliph. But nobody had any claim to being a caliph based on the types of credentials that the first caliphs, the Umayyads and the Abbasids had had. Nor did the Mamluks have that kind of claim. They weren't even Arabs. And the one thing that was understood about the caliphate was that the caliph should be an Arab. In fact, he should be a member of the tribe of Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe from Mecca. There was absolutely no way that the Mamluks could qualify to be caliphs. So what they did in 1260 was that they found a relative of the dead caliph, and they put him on a throne in Cairo, and they said, "You're the caliph." And nobody cared. That caliph, the so-called shadow caliphate, lasts until the Ottoman takeover in 1516. And there's no persuasive record that the caliphs who served during that time ever did anything of note or commanded any broad sense of loyalty, or even that they imparted any particular legitimacy to the Mamluks. They appear to be a kind of a sideshow. This may be a distortion. It may be the caliphs counted for more than they appear, and then it's simply by contrast with the failure or the end of the Abbasid Caliphate that they appear less. But the title that is most important for the Mamluks is this title of the servant of the two holy places. They pour a lot of investment into Mecca and Medina. They become heavily involved in Yemen, and they start to develop relations with the southern part of the Muslim world. That's say those people who live around the Indian Ocean, those people who live in the interior of Africa. It's under the Mamluks, following Ayyubid indication or gestures, that Islam spreads into the Sudan. The frontier of Islam had been pretty much at the Egyptian-Sudanese border for hundreds of years, according to a treaty that was made at the time of the Conquests. Now Islam, under the Mamluks, moves up the Nile. There is a primacy that falls to the pilgrimage to Mecca that if I were redoing a world history, I would put great emphasis upon. Because in my view, to a large degree, the pilgrimage to Mecca and the control of the pilgrimage to Mecca replaces the caliphate as a centralizing institution of the world Muslim community. Say, before 1100, it's hard to even see that Mecca was much more than just a small assemblage of buildings. It had a population of a few thousand, maybe 5,000. It had almost nothing in the way of services for visitors beyond what would be put up temporarily for the pilgrimage itself, for the caravans when they came. But after Salah ad-Din, and even more after the Mamluks, and even more after the Ottomans, Mecca, Medina, particularly Mecca, become highly developed centers. And the pilgrimage, which had been a significant component of Islam ever since the beginning, but had never really had much concrete substance. I mean, the rituals of the pilgrimage were known. You went to Mecca, you did certain rituals, you went home, but that was pretty much what it was. Now, people go to Mecca, by now I mean from the 13th century on, they go to Mecca and they frequently stay for 3, 4, 5 years. And they study. And they become they learn about Islam as it is practiced in Arabia through their pilgrimage. And they learn who is the most important figure in the Islamic world in terms of who is it who controls and provides support for the pilgrims who go to Mecca, Medina. The symbol of this for the Mamluks in Egypt was their adoption of a new ritual. starting very early in the Mamluk period. Can't remember the exact year, I think it's in the 1260s. We have the first indication of the use of what is called the mahmal. The mahmal was a camel saddle, highly decorated as kind of a pavilion, not a pavilion, a compartment that would be placed on top of a camel with all sorts of ornaments on it. And it would be empty. No one would ride in the mahmal. And the mahmal would lead the caravan to Mecca. Before it departed from Egypt, it would tour Cairo and stop at the residences of the major Mamluk rulers, and there'd be sort of blessings associated with this. And the mahmal becomes the symbol of the Egyptian caravan. Nobody knows, at least from what I have read, where or why the custom originated. There have been speculations. We do know that there is a similar mahmal that existed in nomadic tribes in Jordan and Syria in the 20th century, where a tribe, when it traveled, would have a camel carrying an ornamented saddle. That would be empty, just an empty compartment. Some people have said, well, that is the origin of it. Of course, it could be the other way around. It could be that the nomad's mahmal is derived from the one going to Mecca. People have noted in early Islamic history there was a famous battle in which there was an empty, a horse with an empty saddle who was supposed to be there for, essentially for the Messiah, Whether there was originally thought to be some sort of spiritual, specific spiritual content to this is unknown, but what we do know is that other Muslim rulers decided they should have a mahmal too. So you would have a caravan would show up from Egypt, another one would show up from, say, Afghanistan, and each would have a mahmal. And then they'd have a quarrel over which one gets to go into Mecca first. Like donkeys, yes. The donkey of the Messiah. And it was the primacy of the Egyptian mahmal that was important. The mahmal goes to Mecca every year down until after World War I, when the Saudis take over in Mecca, Medina, and bring the practice to an end. So it's a very important ritual. And it is something that is specific to the Mamluk period. We don't know of it being done under the Ayyubids, something the Mamluks thought up. Another thing that happens at this time, and we're dealing here with the 1300s, or very late 1200s, is that for the first time in Islamic history, people start to add to their name a word that means pilgrim. And that word is either Haji or al-Hajj. It had always been possible for someone who went on the pilgrimage, which is called the Hajj, to say, well, I'm a Haji, I went on the pilgrimage. But nobody had ever added it to their name. I haven't found anyone before 1300 who's called Haji so-and-so. After 1300, it becomes extremely common. And it is particularly common in areas of sub-Saharan Africa, India, Southeast Asia, but it's also common in the Middle East. It is accompanied in different countries by different rituals that have to do with the honor that is earned by someone who is a Haji. So someone who has gone on the pilgrimage is now entitled to be called Haji. He can now wear different clothes. He can paint his door green. He can do certain things that nobody else is allowed to do, because going on the pilgrimage imparts an honor within the Muslim context that had not been there before. And the pilgrimage becomes, in the absence or in the aftermath of the caliphate, the pilgrimage becomes the place where Muslims see their connections being formed most strongly. And in later times, people would make use of contacts made in Mecca in ways that are really quite instructive. So you'll have a pilgrim from China will meet a pilgrim from Mecca, hang out together in Yemen, go back to China and transform Chinese Islam. A pilgrim from Indonesia will go to Mecca, hang out for a few years, go back and change the way Islam is recognized in Indonesia. A pilgrim from West Africa will go to Mecca, come back, and change things there. It becomes the center of the Islamic world in almost a literal sense. And there is nothing like it anywhere else in the world. This is very different from, say, pilgrims going to Jerusalem or going to Rome as Christians, where there is a long-standing custom, but it doesn't have the sort of collective impact. In other words, if you make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, you probably don't run into, Ethiopians and Indians and Christians from far, far away. You may, but I don't know of any instances of this. But one of the indications that the Muslim pilgrimage is the model, is the most important one, is that Christians, after 1300, but I don't know exactly when, start to call themselves Haji if they make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So you have Greeks and Serbians who will add Haji to their name because they made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Haji is an Arabic word. The Hajj refers to going to Mecca, not going to Jerusalem. But the notion that pilgrimage deserves to be a part of your identity carries over into the Eastern Christian communities. It does not carry over into Western Europe. I don't know of anyone in Western Europe who is called Haji, but there are Greeks who are certainly called Haji. Often it shows up today in last names like Haji Constantinou or Haji Demetriou or Haji Athanasiou or something like that, and you run into Greeks who have these names. There are some Jews who come to be called, who add Haji to their name after they have visited Jerusalem. In other words, the primacy given to the pilgrimage in this Mamluk era, or the post-Salahuddin era, affects not only the Muslim world, but it affects the notion of what sojourning in a sacred place is all about, even for non-Muslims. To me, this is a really great story in world history. It's the reason I've given so much time to it. Also, I've given a lot of time to it because I've been studying it. And you talk about what you know. But to me, this is kind of the essence of what of a story that really is important for world history because it affects Muslims everywhere in the world in this period after the fall of the Caliphate. And yet it's a story that still has not found a historian. There is a good book on the history of the pilgrimage in the Ottoman Empire by Soraya Faruqi, although that concentrates on it shows how important the pilgrimage is for the Ottomans, but it concentrates on the Ottoman dimension of it without looking at the much broader dimensions I've been trying to stress here. The pilgrimage, so far as I can tell, doesn't have a thing to do with the Mongols. Now, if you were going to look at this Mamluk phenomenon and say, as a state, slave warriors who become the, essentially the rulers of a state that they have no challenge from anyone else. You're going to say, which is more important? The fear of the Mongols, that undoubtedly was real following the Battle of Ain Jalut, or the fostering of a new institutional and ritual emphasis in the Muslim religion, which would be more important? I'm really not sure, but I think that over the long term, the more important one would be the pilgrimage. But you can't get there from a starting point that says that it is fear of the Mongols, or the influence of the Mongols, or the presence of the Mongols that is your main, the main shaping force in world history at this time. In the broad comparison that I started with, where people look at the era of the Mongols from basically the 1200s into the early 1300s, when they look at this era and they say, let's think of this in comparison with the European voyages of discovery, a topic we'll talk about at the very end of this course. You can legitimately ask a question of, well, is it really comparable? Because the voyages of discovery were followed by huge changes in the world that affected pretty much every part of the world for hundreds of years. The Mongol invasions created an empire, but by 1350, it was kind of game over. Not only for the Mongol Empire, but Central Asia never again becomes the center of world history. You could probably make an argument that starting with the Silk Road in 300 BC, perhaps even earlier, and up to the period of the Mongols, ending around, say, 1300 or so AD. The idea of 1600 years during which Central Asia and the transfer of ideas and goods and political ideas and so forth across Central Asia, that this plays a central role in world history. And then you would probably have to say that that comes to an end with the Mongols, and that maybe they should be known not so much as the people who destroyed all the cities, but the people who destroyed Eurasian, the Eurasian contacts that they're kind of ironically credited with having built up, because you don't. I'm leaving out Tamerlane. Now Tamerlane comes along. He briefly holds things together. He dies in 1405. End of the story for Tamerlane. But by and large, it's with the Mongols that this whole Central Asian business comes to an end. And after that, it's maritime contacts that are the dominant ones in world history. So we have, in my book, we have contributed to the reevaluation of the Mongols in their role in world history. And I think it's a reevaluation that can legitimately be queried, not denied. I mean, the Mongols are important, I think, is not deniable. But what they're important for, and whether we should see the 13th century as pivoting around the Mongols, as opposed to around other things. For Egypt and Syria, the pilgrimage; for Russia, Lithuania, perhaps something else; for Japan, as we'll see on Thursday, perhaps other things entirely. It may be that we've gone too far in rehabilitating the Mongols, or that we have stopped short of asking all of the pertinent questions about the role that they played in world history. That sounded really kind of pompous, didn't it? Anyway, might as well stop there.